What's going on, guys? Tower number 9 here, and today we're going to be talking about balance options in tabletop games. In other words, what can developers do when things go wrong? So this is a topic that I think a lot of players are passionate about. If you look at Klavex War Leader over here, was a card from Warhammer 40,000 Conquest LCG that really caused a lot of problems, in my opinion. It ended up very strong and really kind of created some issues for the meta in that game. But the question becomes, if something like that does enter the game, it can be difficult to catch that stuff in testing. Sometimes there's a balance mistake. Sometimes something's too strong. Sometimes something's too weak. And the question becomes, what can the developers do about it? So there's a range of potential options, and this video is going to discuss those, the pros and cons of each, and how we might see that in action in Star Wars Unlimited. So the first option that we have here is very simple. It is do nothing, and maybe the problem will solve itself. So digital games now can do balance updates way more frequently than physical games normally do, but back in the day, digital games didn't do balance updates anywhere near as often, and in some cases you couldn't really do them. So like console games without a real patching system back in the day, it's like, if your NES game is not balanced, it's like, well, it's just going to be unbalanced forever. There's no way to fix it. Um, at least that I'm aware of. And StarCraft Brood War, it did have some balance patches, but the last one was in, I think, 2001. And the final state of StarCraft Brood War is not perfectly balanced. There's things in it that are bad. But while there might be some balance issues, the player base has been really creative and really interesting and has come up with a bunch of new tactics. And the meta for StarCraft Brood War has actually shifted multiple times since that balance patch in 2001 as people use new tactics. Now, to be fair, there have been new maps designed and so on for the game, and the map designs can be a form of balance. So like you can think of certain map characteristics that might favor certain races or address perceived issues in the overall meta, but in terms of how the units work and so on, they've basically been the same. The community can innovate and come up with new tactics. People might have a new style of play that's really good. People might realize, this popular option can be countered, and create a new meta that exists as a result of that. And in games like StarCraft Brood War, they haven't addressed a bunch of balance stuff, and it's basically been fine. Now, StarCraft, though, was played on a professional level in South Korea. There were people who would, their job would be to be a pro gamer. And, I think matches were even televised at times, and people were playing it really intensely and at a very high level of play. A lot of games don't have that level of play, and as a result of that, you can't necessarily rely on people innovating and really trying to figure out these strategies and combinations. Additionally, player expectations have kind of changed, and these days it seems like there's more demand for balance updates than there was in the past. So doing nothing is, the simplest and easiest solution, but it does not always work. However, it does have some pluses, especially in situations where people are crying wolf. They're really concerned about something, but it hasn't been validated as an actual problem. And with time, it is very possible that it will go away. So perhaps, at least at first, doing nothing can be a very appropriate answer to balance questions. Next up, we have silver bullets. So silver bullets are when you print cards in future products that very specifically target other problem cards. So the most extreme case, you might actually have specific other cards listed that you target. So Decipher's old Star Wars CCG had a lot of these. So over there we have It's a Hit. It's a little small and hard to read, but the text of this, if you play it as a lost interrupt, is cancel counter assault, it's worse, Ellis Hellrot, Talon Roll, limited resources, or scanning crew. So it literally just names a bunch of specific cards that you can use it to cancel. And okay, so that is, kind of an extreme level of silver bullet where it just says specific things, though this card also can be used for alternate effects that are not reliant on those specific cards, but there's a very specific list of cards that It's a Hit counters. And Decipher's Star Wars CCG had a lot of designs like this, where there were things that were good against very specific other things. There are also silver bullet designs that aren't quite as specific, but they're still targeted. Sorry, I had slightly wrong bullet points there, but they're fixed now. So Backlash here was a card from the Conquest LCG that was designed to counter that Klavex War Leader, I believe. And so it sort of tried to get two birds with one stone. So one of them was that elite units in that game were not very good, and the other one was that Klavex War Leader was insane. So this card is a very cheap defense, a very cheap defense event for elite units, and it is also a super hard counter to Klavex War Leader in particular, because not only can you cancel its effect, but you can also kill it for 1, and Klavex costs 4. So it is a super hard counter, super targeted towards that interaction, but still has some uses in other cases. And so these sorts of cards allow designers to address balance problems in a way that isn't necessarily that disruptive, but they do have some downsides. So first off, they take a long time to see play. So it might well be like, oh, you have this specific counter that you want to use. You have this specific counter that you want to print. Well, okay, so like, what's the time between you identifying the problem, designing the counter card, putting it into a new set, and printing it? It might actually be quite some time. It might be that you identify something early in the year and you can get the counter card printed in a set that is going to release at the end of the year or maybe early next year. And it depends on the specific release schedule of your particular game and how many products you do per year and so on. But it is not a fast system. Also, these designs are kind of crude in some ways. It is just not a very elegant design to have things that are so specifically designed to counter other things. It can create weird effects overall, and so an example of this is that Backlash was a super hard counter to Klavex War Leader, which was broken, but it was also a super hard counter to a card called Sicarius' Chosen, which was not broken and was in fact kind of mid at that point in the game. That might be controversial with some Conquest fans, but Sicarius' Chosen did not have good stats for cost, and it had an ability that allowed you to move a target that was conditionally quite useful, but it also falls into the Backlash super hard countered phase in a super hard countered state in a way that it probably wouldn't deserve just by coincidence or whatever of having similar warding to Klavex War Leader. So these silver bullets, they're a way that you can do this sort of balance change, and it isn't very disruptive. People can still use all their old cards. There's just more counters, but it takes a while. The designs aren't necessarily all that good, and it feels a little sloppy to have cards that have such narrow applications, especially in the most extreme case where you're just naming stuff that you counter. And again, they try to put in alternate abilities or like side uses or whatever for these, so it's not a totally silver bullet, but it's still it's still a little odd. And in some cases, you can see stuff where it's just not like, I don't think this was designed to be one of these, but there's a card in Magic the Gathering called Tividar's Crusade that specifically kills all goblins and does nothing else. And it's like, I think that they did it like that for some kind of like lore reason, or they thought it would be a cool card. I don't know that goblin decks were broken at the time or whatever, but that's an example of something that if it was being made specifically to counter goblin decks would be a kind of crude counter in my opinion. Okay, so we're going to move on to the next option here, which is points errata. So many games have points systems where you have a total number of like army points or whatever it is, and all the stuff that you have in your deck or in your army cannot cost more than a certain limit. So Star Wars Destiny, for instance, had a point system. And one of the advantages of having a point system is, it's a different style of deck building. One of the things that's cool about it is it allows you to take weaker options, but they use fewer points. And there's kind of it can create some interesting dynamics. If you're playing Star Wars Legion, you could have a squad of basic stormtroopers and it wouldn't cost that much. Or you could have a squad of, elite dark troopers or an ATST or whatever. But for the price of one of those big elite units, you could probably get multiple smaller squads, and it creates some interesting dynamics there. And The one upside of a point system is it allows the designers to do points errata. So points errata is where you don't change anything about the card. The only thing that you change is the points. So on the left, we have FN2199 from Star Wars Destiny. I did not play Star Wars Destiny, but this guy was apparently insanely good when he was first printed, and they did a points errata to make him a fair bit more expensive, and he could still, he could still be played, and he could still use his ability in the same way as earlier, but because he was more expensive, it was more of a trade-off to run him instead of other stuff, and he wasn't quite as good for his cost as he was earlier. And this can be a pretty useful way to address these things. And miniatures games in particular often use points errata. So Star Wars Legion and Warhammer 40K have both printed or have both released like very substantial lists of points erratas, and it's almost a thing that the games can be designed for from the beginning. I'm not sure whether the designers of those games were thinking of it at first, but they're certainly thinking of it now. And while the printed points on a card or in a codex book or whatever it is might be wrong, casual players can still use the older printed points in their games, and it's basically fine. It's less balanced, but there's no requirement to use points updates. And then the points updates are just things that are used in tournament play, so it's less disruptive than other forms of errata. This is pretty common in miniatures games, though it does not work for games without a point system. So miniatures games often have point systems. Star Wars Destiny had a point system, but a lot of card games don't have point systems, and for those, points errata can't be used. Next up, we have restricted lists. So these are ways to limit certain combinations or the number of cards of a certain type you can run. And annoyingly, there are two different things that are called restricted lists. So the first one is the one from Magic the Gathering, and in that one, you can play any restricted card, but you can only play one copy instead of four copies in Magic's case. But if they did a restricted list like this for Star Wars Unlimited, it would be one copy instead of three. So Magic uses this basically for some cards that are unbalanced, and they don't want you to have four Black Lotus, but they're like, okay, you can have one. Um, the other form of restricted list lists a bunch of cards that cannot be used together. So it might be like, hey, we're going to list off 4 or 5 things, and you have to pick one of these, and that's the only one you can put in your deck. This was used by Fantasy Flight Games in the past with Legend of the Five Rings and Game of Thrones LCG, I believe, maybe some of their other games as well. And this form of restricted list is cool because it allows you to stop certain combos if they're broken. So as an example, if there are 2 cards that are fine on their own but ruin the game if they're combined, like maybe they just win immediately or do something insanely powerful, you could print a restricted list and have those 2 cards be the only ones on it, and people could go on using the cards, they just couldn't use the unfair combination. These also allow you to limit unbalance. If you just put a bunch of cards that are generically strong and not necessarily combos, you might force people to make more difficult trade-offs in terms of what they want to run and what they think they can substitute with other weaker effects or similar. And one advantage of both of this and the Magic the Gathering style restricted list is that it avoids making cards totally unusable. So if you have your, your rare Alpha Edition Black Lotus or whatever it is, you can still play that, and you can play that in a tournament. Just you can only have one. If you have 4, you're out of luck for that. But this is not as harsh as banning the card altogether, and it helps maintain some value for the card for those people who have collected it already. The stronger form of the restricted list is the banned list. So in the banned list, you just remove an option. If something's just way too good, you might be like, nope, this has to go. So Duskblade here is a card from Flesh and Blood TCG that was infamously banned before it was even released. It had been previewed, and it was so obviously unbalanced in preview gameplay that LSS actually released an article where they just said, Duskblade, we made a mistake. This card is too good, and it should not exist in this game, and we are going to ban it in Constructed. I think it was allowed in Blitz, but I think it eventually got banned in Blitz too. I think it just ended up coming in just way too hot. And Sometimes that's the right thing to do. I was actually pretty impressed. I was playing Fab at that time, and I was pretty impressed by LSS's willingness to get rid of this card. I had actually made a video highlighting how strong it was before it had even come out. It seemed like it was just crazy, and LSS took action to address that before the card came out and caused a lot of disruption to events. Banning it before it was released also meant that people weren't doing a bunch of purchases or trades or whatever to get the card as a single and then being disappointed. We can also see ban lists used for effects that are just not wanted in the game. So here we have Scheherazade, or however that's pronounced. This is a magic card that is infamous for its extremely complicated resolution criteria. So this is a card where when you play it, it's actually so crazy. So when you play this card, you leave the current game where it is. You take your deck and you then play a new game with the cards that are left in your deck from the first game. And the person who lost the person who lost that game loses half their life. And the amount of time that it takes to resolve this card is so high that it had to be removed because it was disruptive. Like, you might have a situation where it's like, oh, here we have these two decks, and we can about do three rounds in the time, but it might be close. Adding in like entire extra sub games, which can potentially happen multiple times, is just way too much. And this card was removed because it is just not something that works with the tournament structure. There's other examples of stuff that's just that can be just sort of crazy. So Magic the Gathering used to have certain cards that involved physical dexterity, like you would throw the card onto the field and it would have effects based on what cards it physically touched. They decided that was not a mechanic they wanted to have in their game, so all the physical dexterity cards are, I believe, banned. They had some cards that introduced like a betting mechanic called ante, where like the winner of the game would actually like take cards from the opponent's deck permanently. And that was like, I'm not even sure if that's legal in some areas, but legality aside, it was not desirable for various reasons. So the anti cards are banned now. And banning is really the best way to deal with mechanics like that, where you eventually decide, hey, this just should not be in the game. There's no version of this that we think is okay. We need to just get that out of there. Now, the downside of banning is that it's really harsh for people who bought the card because they can't use their card anymore. And it can be especially questionable for expensive cards just in terms of people's attitudes. So, as an example, I don't know. So there was Bravo Star of the Show, was a leader or was a hero in Flesh and Blood who was really strong and who many people consider to be unbalanced. They did not prematurely ban that card, even though it was really strong and perceived to be unbalanced. In part because it would have made a bunch of. In part, I presume, I don't have insider knowledge on LSS's inner workings on that, but I think that if they had prematurely banned it and just been like, nope, you can't play that anymore, it would have, or if they had done that like midway through the season, it would have been really frustrating for people who had bought a bunch of Guardian cards to play that deck and bought the Bravo Star of the Show card itself and so on. So that is kind of a downside of banning things, and might be necessary in some cases. Doesn't require any errata. It's pretty straightforward. It's just like, hey, you can't put this in your deck for a tournament, but it's still, and you can still play these things casually, most likely. But at a lot of places, people will say, hey, even in a casual game, I don't want to play against banned cards or whatever. And so you get this situation where um, banning something. Banning something can be harsh for people who already own the cards, but it might be necessary. All right. Next up, we have balance errata. So balance errata is, in a certain sense, the best option possible, but it's also not popular, which is going to sound, that might sound kind of weird, but basically allows you to make really precise and effective changes, but the problem is that it is also very disruptive and the cards don't do what they say and so on. So in balance errata, you're going to change the text of a card to be different and to be more balanced. So procedural interference here is a card from Legend of the Five Rings where you chose, so it's choose an opponent's province, that opponent selects one, 1, either discard each card in that province or you gain 2 honor. The problem with this card was that you could choose your opponent's stronghold province, and they would basically, you basically just get 2 honor every time because of how that game's stronghold system worked. And so this card got a balance errata that changed it so that it was choose an opponent's non-stronghold province. I believe. I don't remember the exact wording, but basically you couldn't use it on the stronghold province anymore. And so that made the card weaker but more balanced, and it made that choice more of a real thing. So balance errata can be very good. It allows you for really targeted, like, fine tuning of the card to buff it or nerf it. You could change stats or costs or similar sorts of things, like not points cost or whatever, but the actual play cost in game. And it is extremely prevalent in digital card games because the downside is mitigated. When the cards aren't physical objects, but they're things that exist in a digital client, it is much easier to change them in a way that is seamless for players. Like, they might have to read the patch notes and see that things are different now. And people might be frustrated about that, but it's very different from when you've printed out, hundreds of thousands of physical cards that now have wrong information on them. And so digital card games do balance errata a lot, and that's actually one of their advantages over physical card games in some ways, is that it's much easier for them to do this sort of thing. And there you do actually sometimes see mechanics where they will allow people to they'll allow people to get rid of cards that they had that got nerfed in exchange for more of the crafting resource or whatever it is. I remember Cards CCG would do that. And I think Hearthstone maybe did something similar, but I didn't really play Hearthstone. So yeah, so that's a situation where digital games have a bit of an advantage. Now, you can do balance errata with physical games. So Legend of the Five Rings was a physical game, and it did have some balance errata, but it's annoying to have physical cards not do what they say. In principle, you could mitigate this by printing corrected versions of the cards as like an organized play promo or something. So as an example of that, in Star Wars Unlimited, we have those organized play weekly play packs that have the hyperspace, we have the hyperspace cards from the starter and the alt arts and stuff like that. You can imagine like some future season where they print an alt art that also has new stats or whatever for an existing card because they've done a balance change to that card. That's something they totally could do, and it would mitigate the problem to a degree, but even still, you can only do this so much. So while in principle, balance errata might be the best solution and allowing for the most fine-tuned changes, it might be too costly to use all the time. Magic the Gathering actually only uses balance errata for digital only cards, I believe. They have Magic the Gathering Arena, and they have some cards that are digital only, and those cards can have balance errata, but for physical cards, they only use the banned and restricted list. And so now the question becomes, how often are balance changes needed? And here we have Restoration of Balance, another card from a card from Legend of the Five Rings that itself got some balance errata. I think it got changed to be an interruption. It was interrupt after the province was broken instead of reaction when the province was revealed. And if you don't know L5R, that might not mean a lot to you, but it was an extremely major nerf to this card. And I did pick it in part though because the name Restoration of Balance is fitting for this discussion. So the thing is, there is no like super easy solution on how often balance changes are needed. It really depends on how unbalanced the game actually is. So some games can go really long times without needing balance changes. And other times the balance might not be great, but the developers might perceive, making balance changes as being more disruptive or negative than it's otherwise worth. However, if you let like a bad meta linger, it can really frustrate people and cause problems. So most games of this type that I'm aware of have multiple balance updates per year. So Games Workshop, which does Warhammer, does 4 points updates and 2 or more balance errata sets yearly. And in practice, they do substantially more than that in some cases. A lot of card games will have banned and restricted list updates multiple times a year. And digital games can get away with more updates and can patch very frequently, similar to live service, similar to like normal live service games. But especially for physical games, updating too much can also be risky. So if you're updating, if there's a new balance patch every week, people are going to get really annoyed at that. It's not going to be something that people react positively to. Um, because it's going to feel like, hey, my cards don't do what they say. Why are things changing so much? What's going on here? People are going to miss out on stuff and like come to tournaments with decks that aren't legal or are much worse or whatever it is. It just it's very possible to overdo it. Now, on the other hand, I also think it's possible to underdo it. There was Star Wars Legion, the miniatures game, is now under the control of Atomic Mass Games, and there was an interview with them recently where one of their staff members said that they thought that a yearly balance update was too fast and they were aiming for 18 to 24 months, I believe. I might be misremembering that. I think that is not a I'm not a professional game developer. I'm not a professional game designer, but my opinion as a competitive player of various games is that 18 to 24 months between balance updates is probably not fast enough, especially when you are competing at this point with Games Workshop, Star Wars Legion's biggest competitor, is doing 6 or more updates per year. And honestly, one update a year is probably not fast enough for something like Star Wars Legion. If I ran the circus, as the old Dr. Seuss book goes, I would probably be wanting to have a balance update something like every 6 months for that game. But that's not my responsibility. I'm sure they have reasons for making the decisions that they're making, but these days there are a lot of good games out there, and players are uh, able to choose between games that update on a much faster timeline. So insofar as there are rules issues that might need a change, I think waiting, a year and a half or whatever is not really that good. Now, and this is also something that's really changed, with digital games having fast updates and also just with a changing market in the physical game world. I think that the amount of balance updates you have to do now is probably higher than it was in the past. I remember when I was a kid playing Warhammer, it was, they'd come out with your army book or your codex. And if your army book or codex was bad, tough luck. You'll get a new one in 3 years. Like actually though, like it was just there was just the possibility for things to be broken or things to be way too weak or whatever for years at a time, because at that time they didn't do frequent updates. There, in a rare case there might be something in White Dwarf magazine or whatever, but most of the time it would be quite some time between new army books, and if you got a bad one, that was just it for a while. So fortunately, times have really changed, and we're seeing more balance changes these days than we did back then. But I do think it's a big difference from what I was used to, and I think that insofar as someone is remembering what was true when they were a kid, I think the standards in the industry have changed, and these days I feel like a faster pace is required. Now, that's just my opinion as a player. I could be totally off base. Like I said with my first point, sometimes doing nothing can actually be a good option because it will give the community more time to figure out counters and stuff to things, and maybe they'll be able to come up with those solutions that don't require any changes at all. StarCraft Brood War, that meta evolving with no changes at all from Blizzard for many years, or bug fixes or whatever only. And you know there is some merit to that, but personally I do think that these days it seems like the standard is to have multiple updates per year. And, when I heard things like the 18 to 24 months or whatever from Star Wars Legion, that seemed like it wasn't fast enough relative to its competition, both physical and especially digital. But, like I said, I'm not a professional game designer. That's just my opinion. So let's move on to how this might affect Star Wars Unlimited TCG. So there are some cards that probably came in a bit strong in this game. So Boba Fett collecting the bounty, leader Boba, is deploys at 5 resources and he's 4/7. Um, I think the game would almost surely be more balanced if Boba deployed 5 resources as a 4/6. I think that would be a relatively small change. It would be unlikely to ruin the game, but with the benefit of hindsight and looking at the stuff that we've seen, Boba's stats are probably too good for his deployment timing. But that does not mean I'm like, hey, FFG, we need an errata immediately. Like, release the balance update and change Boba's stats or put him to 6 resources or whatever it is. No, I don't think it's time for that, actually. As it stands, things seem okay. There's interesting exploration. People are figuring out the meta. It's too early to make like big changes, in my opinion, and the meta as a whole actually seems pretty healthy. We also haven't really had the number of official competitive events that we would need to say things about the balance really definitively. Um, so as it stands, I actually don't think Star Wars Unlimited needs any changes at all. There are some things that I would probably change. So this will never happen, but I think the game would almost surely be more balanced if they did a combination errata rule, like balance change, fluff change, just change everything about the card. So Fett's Fire Spray is instead the IG 2000, and it works with IG 88 instead of Boba Fett, and it has different art and different. But of course, they will never do this. I do think the game would be more balanced, but I think it would be a ridiculous change to make at this time. Um, just the amount of overhaul you would have to have with something like that is just not worth it. Um, and for the smaller stuff like Boba at 6 resources or Boba at 4-6, yeah, the game would probably be better balanced with that change, but I don't know that that is an important enough change to necessitate making a big balance update, especially this early on. Now, if we had seen every tournament having the results of that early tournament from the UK where Boba was the whole top 8, yeah, maybe it's time to make a change. But as it stands, that isn't the case, and I think there's still a interesting meta with room for things to evolve. Stuff could change in the future, sure. Maybe some of this stuff will be looked at in the future. But as it stands, I actually think Star Wars Unlimited is in a really good state. I've been very impressed with the balance overall. That doesn't mean I think every option is great. I think that it is. It seems relatively clear that Boba Fett is a stronger leader card than IG-88 or Harrison Dula. But I don't think that the situation is so bad that FFG needs to take action. It'll be interesting to see what happens in the future. I do suspect we will see changes at some point. I am not saying that I know when that point will be. I'm not saying I don't even have a clear prediction as to when that will be. But typically speaking, designing and balancing games is really hard, and there are probably going to be some things that slip through the cracks. So I do think it's likely that we will start seeing balance updates of one sort or another for Star Wars Unlimited eventually, but I don't think it needs to be anytime soon. And honestly, unless we see some huge problems in the meta, or with the upcoming Store Showdown series, maybe things will be really skewed or whatever. But I will be a little surprised if we see any sort of balance update or change from FFG before the second set comes out. Especially because their full competitive program or whatever isn't going to start until later. Now, FFG, maybe is going to hear this and laugh behind their hands or whatever as they set the balance update PDF to go live on the website next week. It'd be funny if it happened, but my prediction will be we will see balance changes of some kind or another in Star Wars Unlimited eventually, but that it will probably not happen at least until the second set comes up. Could be wrong. Those are just my thoughts, and I'd be curious to hear your thoughts if you have any of your own takes on the balance as a whole. What methods of balance errata make the most sense, and what you're hoping to see from Fantasy Flight Games in this area. I'd love to hear them in the comments below. So yeah, thanks for watching, guys, and we will be back later with some more Star Wars Unlimited content. I will catch you guys later.